Welcome to week 6, online world civ section. This is Professor Brandenburg reporting from Flat Creek Road here in Black Mountain. This week, week 6, we are on the topic of two very influential 19th century ideologies that still hold sway in much of the world. One of them is, of course, capitalism, and the other is communism. Next week, we're on to the topic of nationalism, another 19th century ideology, and we'll look at the makings of modern countries like Germany and France. Next week, we also have quiz number 3, test number 3. But for today, this week, it's a slightly lighter week. The reading is a little bit shorter. I'll ask that you engage in a sort of broader discussion on capitalism and communism in the conversing with the past discussion section. Do this by Friday and then respond to peer by next Tuesday. There is an online debate that I invite you to watch. If you reference that, it's extra credit coming up in the next test. And that is a debate between a Catholic socialist, Liz Brunick, a very popular, very young writer who has an opinion column at the New York Times, as well as sort of a very winsome libertarian. So I invite you to click on that and watch that in addition to this hopefully briefer lecture. Okay, we're going to talk about capitalism today and communism in due time. And I want to start off by sort of framing this in the longue durée, the very big sort of picture in human history. Listen, in our country, capitalism is largely embraced, sometimes with hesitancy, but sometimes with great intensity. It's very much part of the DNA of this republic. And yet it's not without complaints, right? In recent years, there's been a number of protest movements pushing back against capitalism, right? There's been critiques of consumerism and the role of advertising and corporations in our individual lives. A 1987 film called Wall Street was supposed to sort of mock the travails of finance culture, yet this turned out to be sort of a heroic film for some in the finance industry. There's Gordon Gekko. But critiques of capitalism are actually not new. Arguably, for the first 1400 years, in at least the Christian story, capitalism was not very well regarded in the Christian tradition. Right? In 1304, Giotto, an Italian painter, created this mosaic on a church in Italy. The expulsion of the money lenders. You may recall the story where Jesus Christ in the Holy Week during Easter attends the temple, and there he sees merchants exchanging money, making a profit on what he perceives as sacred ground, right? And ever since then, there is this sort of soft and at times intense criticism of making money, right? Making money for the purpose of making money does not necessarily lead to a holy life. Those with great wealth may have a harder time finding the richness of salvation we learn from the New Testament. And I don't want to say this sort of hinders or pauses capitalism from emerging, but it certainly isn't helping. It's also intriguingly true that in the Middle Ages, trade and business is much more encouraged in places like China, as well as in the Islamic Middle East, where the founder of that Abrahamic tradition, right, the Prophet Muhammad, had a past life as, or earlier in his life, he worked as a merchant on the Silk Roads. So that was always a sort of pro-business culture. It's not really until the Renaissance period where business starts to get, and what would become sort of modern capitalism begins to get a better name. Some of this is emerging with a thinker named Luca Pacioli. He writes Summa de Arithmetica in 1494. This is the inventor of sort of modern accounting, right? Double ledger accounting. Where it's like, listen, if you watch the money carefully, if you look at the traffic flows, making money is not predetermined to the fates of the world. It's actually sort of like a science that you can have sort of confidence in. And when the Protestant Reformation came along, they were much more open to sort of merchant culture than Catholic Europe was, right? John Calvin, reformer who ran Geneva in Switzerland, right? And eventually is an inspiration for pilgrims and Puritans and other folks that would begin to migrate to the United States, or what would become the United States. They begin to push this idea that, listen, hard work is really important. Work is important, and investing your extra wealth back into your business, this is wise. And for the first time, you see this sort of cultural shift where being a merchant, making money, is looked at with newfound respect. In the past, it was sort of the clergy or the aristocracy, or the intellectual life that is regarded as the highest. Now there's a subtle shift where this merchant class, which is emerging all across Europe, in Catholic and in Protestant territories, has a sort of a newfound cultural cachet. And to see this no more clearly than in the very first capitalist country, and that is Holland, nation of tulips and ice skating. Do yourself a favor, this as an aside, there's some frozen ponds in Holland, and there's a man who falls through the ice while ice skating in downtown Holland. It's a lot of fun. Check this out. Okay, but the Dutch, in this age of exploration, remember in week 1 we talked about Columbus and Vasco da Gama and all these Amerigo Vespucci, all these characters who are going west into India. And these expeditions, as you recall, are incredibly expensive. Christopher Columbus himself spent a decade asking for just three ships to go west, right? Eventually, it's the monarch of Spain who pays for it. So it's not an easy thing to invest in these early shipping endeavors. And in Holland, they figure out a way to sort of bypass the incredible risk of investing in a shipping expedition, which could reap great profits, and yet few people can afford to do it because the risk of a failed, shipping venture is cataclysmic. So expensive were they. So they invent something called the joint stock company, where individuals can team up by a share of a larger sort of expedition. And they launched the VOC, and eventually this is so profitable that they take over much of East Asia, including what becomes Indonesia, places like Jakarta. So all this wealth is now flowing into Little Amsterdam as they kind of run the spice trade in the 16th and 17th centuries. And with it, there's this sort of newfound glorification of investment and capital and the new rising merchant class. You see this very clearly in one of my favorite paintings by Johannes Vermeer, the lace maker. I noticed this young woman working on a piece of lace that will be sold at market. This is viewed with a certain spiritual aura, right? The light is coming from the heavens down at this young worker's forehead. Right, there's a sort of a grace, a beauty, a holiness to our work that previously you only saw in paintings about religious icons or was celebrated in things like war. This is celebrated. This is beauty. On the other side of the slide, you can see sort of a family working on their wares, and this is sort of glorified in Holland. Now, as there are these kind of capital revolution occurring in Holland and reverberating across Europe, there is a man of the Enlightenment named Adam Smith. He's an enlightened thinker like Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu and Diderot and all these others. He's sort of in that world. So he is an 18th century Scottish figure. And he's a moral philosopher, and he writes this book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776, an iconic year, of course. And he looks specifically at pin making. And he makes the claim that, listen, one person, a craftsman, can make 20 pins a day. From beginning to end, he can make 20 pins a day. But if he teams up with 20 other pen makers, and they all focus exclusively on one particular aspect of making that pen, then they can make 48,000 of them. And everyone will be making more money. So this is called a division of labor. And sure enough, people get into it and they notice you can make a lot more money if you divide the labor. Now, as a consequence, it's this world of sort of the artisan craftsman who is the master of his own domain slowly begins to decline. In a few moments, we'll talk about Marx and how he critiques this decline of the artisan. But in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith has this key insight on sort of how to be more efficient in making pens. And like Newton and other scientists, he's looking at the natural world for sort of God-given principles. And he frames the economy as sort of a natural law, right? Like gravity. It's just in that vein. He said this: money, goods, and services orbit the planet the way the planet orbits the sun, naturally and unvaryingly. Now listen, there is a current revolution in economic theory. It's called behavioral economics that pushes back on this idea that laws of economy are as scientifically grounded as, let's say, gravity. Okay, that's a debate for business class, but you should sort of be aware of that. The guys who did Freakonomics sort of push against this in soft ways. But back in 1776, Adam Smith is seeing certain principles as being sort of scientific principles, like the law of supply and demand, right? Where you'll sell more lemonade on July 4th as a 5-year-old in this particular country because there's a big demand for lemonade on July 4th, and if you want to, you can even raise the prices for that lovely, delicious lemonade on that particular day. And backing up all these principles is this idea that the government, if they begin to regulate or intrude in the economy with tariffs or with further taxes, this will hurt sort of science working itself out. This will hurt prosperity in the big perspective. Right? He called this the hidden hand of this science. Right? He's like, listen, people aren't always doing everything for their own benevolence. Here's a picture of an early dentist, right, doing this. Probably not a very fun job, causing pain, especially in this period on children. But Smith writes, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker, or in our case, the dentist, that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. So we believe sort of self-interest is the key driver for sort of wealth creation, and from a big perspective, flourishing, for a larger flourishing society. And lest you believe that this is all sort of greed-based, right? Gordon Gekko's Greed is Good framework. He has some moral tinges to that people sometimes forget about. So, for example, he's an early critic of slavery, right? Before the abolitionist movement is sort of really up and running, he says slavery is really inefficient, right? Violence, he makes the argument, is not an incentive to workers. Pay them a fair, or what we might call today a living wage, right? We're in this moment where there's discussions of raising the minimum wage from goodness $7 or $8 to $15. But violence is not an incentive to workers. Pay people well, respect them in their work, and your business will do better. Now, if Holland was the first country to move through sort of a capitalist revolution, Britain really perfects it. In the 1800s, Britain is applying these principles, and they are absolutely flourishing as their empire spread across the world. People said the sun never set on the British Empire. By the 1850s, they had the world's largest economy. They're huge in cotton. They're getting cotton from the American South. But listen, when the Civil War comes along, the South thought they would be recognized by Great Britain because of this deep connection to cotton that England needed to launch this industrial revolution. And now everyone's wearing cotton, right? And suits, not silks. It's a big change. People for the first time have more than 2 pairs of clothes in their lives. But during the Civil War, Britain's like, shoot, what are we gonna do? Our cotton supply is cut off from the Confederate States. I guess we'll just get it from Egypt and from India. So that sort of dooms the South in the war effort, at least from gaining international legitimacy. But they're also making huge maneuvers in shipbuilding. Cities like Liverpool and Manchester um, are really big here. They're creating steel and coal, sort of new energy bases, which are also changing the environment and, of course, tragic ways. But you have these huge new cities, right? Today, these are great soccer cities with huge mega clubs playing European football there. But cities like Manchester and Liverpool are absolutely booming. But people are noticing that these cities aren't particularly attractive. Now, listen, if you go there today, there's this beautiful sort of 19th century aesthetic. They're wonderful, wonderful cities. You should go visit Manchester and Liverpool. But people also critiqued this capitalist society and in England. Listen, in a few moments, we'll get to Karl Marx and his very famous critique of capitalism. But you should know that from within British society, writers and thinkers, indeed Christian public intellectuals, are also sort of critiquing the society. So one of the critiques is coming from the very famous writer, the most famous writer of the 19th century, Charles Dickens, who, listen, this guy was a capitalist in a sense. He learned that if he published books chapter by chapter, he could make more money than publishing it all at once. So the way we sometimes watch TV shows, over the holidays, many of you waited for the next episode of The Mandalorian to drop. He would drop chapters of his books, like A Tale of Two Cities, one chapter at a time, because that maximized his profits. But he was also critical of the society that was forming in England. In his 1854 book, Hard Times, Charles Dickens talks about the factory owner, Mr. Hardgrind, right? And this is a character that starts on moral, but as he becomes wealthier, his morality decreases, and soon he's taking advantage of women who are destitute, taking advantage of them in an abusive way. He's taking advantage of children. He's discarding old people once they're no longer necessary to work in the factories or not as productive as younger, healthier workers. And he's really critiquing sort of the lack of value capitalism has on the lives of workers. Right? This is what he writes in sort of 19th century rhetoric that we might not discuss anymore. He's describing one of these big industrial cities. It was a town of red brick, or of brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. So he's really sort of depressed at even the sort of environmental change that is occurring in England. Another one is critiquing the lives, critiquing capitalism, but not necessarily from the lives of workers, but another character is John Ruskin, a writer who publishes Onto This Last in 1860. And he's kind of critiquing at consumer society, right? The kind of people we've become. And this book, it's like, listen, we now live in a society where we can buy all these little things that we don't need, like embroidered handkerchiefs or embroidered collars. These are things we don't need. We've become sort of greedy consumers who organize their lives around buying more and more things. Of course, this is a world that is probably very familiar to us, right? We can go to the dollar spot, Target, and buy things we don't need. So he's critiquing sort of this consumer revolution that is occurring in England. It's like, listen, we buy too many cheap things that we don't need. What if we thought carefully about the way we invest in our culture, right? He looked at Venice. He said, listen, money should be spent morally on truly noble things, right? A few hundred years earlier in Venice, they spent their money on very expensive, beautiful buildings, on paintings, right? They created a beautiful city, unlike Liverpool or Manchester, which was covered in pollution. So that was sort of another angle of critiquing this new capitalist society, which, again, more and more people are joining the middle class. There's more and more wealth. But there's also problems, and you should know that it's not just Karl Marx who critiques it, right? It's also Ruskin and Dickens and folks like that. Now, I want to sort of defend in a soft way capitalism um, by and also talking about its discontents by jumping into the future. Let's jump forward to the year 1963 and look at East Germany. And at this time, East Germany is a communist nation and the Iron Curtain, perceived as a successful communist nation. And they really kind of took aim, they introduced a neues ökonomisches System, NES. And they aimed at the sort of the failures of capitalism. They critiqued this culture of that's emerging of sort of rock and roll and Levi's jeans and this new rugged individualism that is washing over the West. And said, we need to spend time on noble things in life, like reading Plato and Marx and producing really high quality television about sort of tractor supply. Germans love their factory tour stuff, right? But we can have a society that gets at all the things that capitalism doesn't by being sort of a state-planned, economy. Now, inadvertently, this neues ökonomisches System proves to be an inadvertent tribute towards capitalism. Germans love their coffee, and in 1976, there's a huge surge in the price of coffee coming from Brazil and so forth. So they take all the coffee off the shelves and they replace it with what's called Mischkaffee, which is 51% coffee. It's, sugar beet, rye, chicory, all these things that, don't necessarily taste amazing. The Germans revolt. They're out marching the street. They want their coffee back. But the state has made the decision that we can't afford it, right? And to quell this demand for coffee, they actually bring in the Stasi, the secret police, and they begin to arrest people, right, in this sort of closed society. So this desire for coffee kind of shows that capitalism is especially good at providing the little things in life that we enjoy. Fast forward to 1989. The Berlin Wall fell, right? We'll learn about this in one of the last weeks of class. Country after country in Eastern Europe turns capitalist and democratic. But as soon as the Berlin Wall fell, all these people who were in East Berlin in the communist regime head to the west section, which was sort of free and Western, and they had sort of modern grocery shops there. So they went to places like Edeka, and they just marveled at the choice that was available to the people living under a capitalist society. But of course, there's also pains with this, right? In our lifetimes, we've seen a number of sort of struggles against the world that capitalism has created. Before many of you were born in 1999, the World Trade Organization, which still meets, the WTO, they met that year in Seattle. And there were protests, kind of anti-Starbucks protests about, rising global inequality and so forth. The people protesting were far left-stream folks. But in response, right, the riot police were brought in and people were arrested. It wasn't as intense as the coffee riots in 1976 in East Berlin, but it reminded us that the state will intervene on behalf of its economic system regardless. Again, you may have remembered Occupy Wall Street movement, which brought, in the aftermath of the economic recession of 2008, in which the United States government, both Republican and Democrats alike, chose to sort of reward and save the wealthy bankers and abandon, to some degree, many of the middle and lower middle class Americans who were entering into homes. So the homes were not bailed out, but the banks were, right? And from their perspective, this led rise to further global inequality, where we have this what from their perspective is the 1% who hoard most of the world's wealth. And historically, it is true that wealth inequality is sort of where it's at in the 1830s and 1840s. There's a lot of stratification in the world today. And some of what Charles Ruskin talked about is still sort of with us, right? I think back to a story in 2015. Listen, I love Apple. I love Apple products. But in 2015, They're coming out with this new Apple Watch. And I wonder if John Ruskin would say, do we really need this Apple Watch? Is this really necessary for our lives? Well, listen, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But at the same time, uh, there were troubles with its production. An Apple subsidiary known as Foxconn was, basically hiring prisoners to work and create these products. People are committing suicide in these plants. It was just a really terrible condition, kind of reminding us of Dickens' critique. What is happening to the workers? So tensions remain within capitalism. Much of the world is living under capital regime. Even communist nations like Vietnam and, of course, China have their own brand of authoritarian capitalism that, on the surface, is actually incredibly effective. So we do live in the world that Adam Smith invented. All right, now for the second part of our discussion. This brings us to the historical figure of Karl Marx. And he's a figure that, like Dickens and like Ruskin, is examining the Industrial Revolution, which took first place in England, of course moves to the United States, and eventually much of the Western world in the 1800s. And as we hinted at in the first part of this lecture, the world of work that is emerging in places like Liverpool is really difficult work. It's very dangerous work. People are living in sort of tenement housing. As you can see on the side of the slide here, there's rampant pollution. You can barely recognize cities anymore. On this slide, you can see a map of sort of where it's emerging, predominantly in Europe, then the United States. And it's really launching a world population growth that's moving people into the cities as well. But there's some difficulties with it, right? Especially for those who are working in the factories. There's a number of responses to the plight of the worker, many of whom have just moved into cities from sort of rural, medieval kind of farm environments. One of them is the liberal response, in a sort of a classic sense, the liberal response. This is to say, listen, if we have a free press, they can go after companies that behave poorly, right? You see this, for example, in America with Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which comes out in 1906, a text where he looked at the Chicago meat packing environment. By the way, Chicago, with the new meat packing capabilities in the late 1800s, and refrigeration that's developed now for the first time, like people can eat meat quite often, not just a few times a year. But these factories were really terrible, and he talks about how there's rat poop everywhere, right? So like, let's reform the factories so they're cleaner and so forth. So that was one response. Another response was to give more and more of these workers, many of whom didn't own property, therefore couldn't vote, give them the franchise. So across Europe and the Americas, more and more workers are given the vote. So that's sort of a response to, and with the vote, they have power to sort of push back and argue for better working conditions. Another response was the Romantic response, right? In the 19th century, we see the rise of Romantic culture. You see this with Beethoven and Wagner, with literature in the 19th century, right? Of kind of the sense of longing. I see this in the film Les Mis, remember, which is not a film about the French Revolution. It's a film about the 1830 student revolt that wanted to bring back the ideals of the French Revolution in Paris. But this is really all sort of feeling. There's no specific plan. There are a group that has a specific plan that's different from sort of the liberal standard response, and that's called the utopian socialists. Right? These are individuals who believe the state should take a more pivotal role in helping the lives of workers. Now, in the early 1900s in Europe, most of these are kind of Catholics, right? There's they believe this is like kind of reviving the ancient ideals of first century Christian life together, right? One of the key figures here is Count Henri de Saint Simon, right? He's the one who coins the phrase, from each according to his ability, to each according to his work. And he's arguing that governments should have a responsibility in this new industrial society to uplift those who are poorer and take a bit more control in the economy. There's others like Charles Fournier of France, who has these sort of utopian ideas of creating this, everyone should have this aristocratic life where we all live in a palace like Versailles and we'll all have jobs like Henri de Saint Simon said. It'll be this perfect community. The problem is you need industry and someone to fund this, and he has a hard time finding both. Which brings us to Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a combative philosopher and writer in his time, who would, if it weren't be what happened in Russia in 1917, probably be regarded as a minor European thinker who wouldn't get mentioned in a World Civ big picture class like this. But because of what happens in the future, we engage with his thoughts. So he's part of this. He's part of another category that's looking at the changes of the Industrial Revolution, and that is that he is a revolutionary socialist. So, who is Karl Marx? Karl Marx is born in 1818 in what becomes Germany. He's born in Bonn in the Rhine Valley, which is really the Silicon Valley of the era, in a region of great sort of economic prosperity, at least in Germany. His father's in law, and he wants his son to become successful, so he goes off to university. At university, he kind of geeks out in philosophy, and eventually studies under Georg Hegel, who was a giant in intellectual life in Europe at the time, probably the most prominent thinker. He had this idea called the dialectic, right? That market forces kind of rule life. And there's a gradual evolution of humanity from hunter and gatherers to, small villages to eventually monarchies. And then we have constitutional monarchies. And he had this dialectic, which means that there is a dominant way of doing things. He called this the thesis. And then there's a new way of seeing things. This is the antithesis. And the future is a combination of both of those, which he called the synthesis. Thesis plus antithesis, different idea, equals the new normal, the new common sense, if you will. So he's studying this, and he's looking at sort of evolution of society, and he begins to believe that a radical form of socialism, which he coined as communism, is the final synthesis, sort of the end of human evolution. Now, he gets his PhD, and these ideas are dangerous. Can't get a job teaching. So he starts becoming an influencer. In 1842, he is a writer and journalist for the Rheinische Zeitung. Within a year, his ideas are too radical, and he escapes with his family and his 10 children, some of whom died in childhood. But what's intriguing about Marx is that he had a famously, conservative social life, kind of devoted to, by all accounts, someone who spent a lot of time with his children, had a sort of a loving marriage, as Marxists will always point to, and sometimes made bad choices because he spent money on his children when he didn't have the cash, to buy them, flute lessons and things like this. So, large family. He's, kicked out of Germany, goes to Paris. He writes there. He's kicked out of Paris, then moves to Belgium. Writes there. He's kicked out of Paris. Then he ends up in England, and he is amazed at England. It's this open, free society where there's this marketplace of ideas. Dude loves England. But all along, he's part of this course of individuals that is critiquing capitalism. And listen, he says things that I find just incredibly insightful. There's a reason eventually, a third to half the world's population is living under, pretty terrible totalitarian communist regimes. This is alluring to individuals. So we should engage with what he's saying. saying, listen, modern work is alienating. He critiqued this idea of sort of Adam Smith's pin making, right? Adam Smith said if you sort of take these artisans and turn them into specialists, like in a factory setting, you can produce more. Now, this turned out to be true. There was a lot more wealth generated. But Marx is saying this kind of work, it's alienating. It's also insecure. You can replace kind of as a cog in the machine. And he also said sort of modern work is immoral. It creates us into creatures that we really shouldn't be. It forces us to make choices based on economics, like who we get to marry and so forth, right? And he also says it's unstable, right? Factories boom and bust. And he says it's immoral if you look at the slide right here, because it's generally helping only a few people, right? The pyramid of capitalist system at the bottom, right, are all the people working, right? Then you have the managers who are having a better life. Then the soldiers support that. Then the church is supporting that. Then at the top you have the business leaders and the monarchies of the day. So he argued in essence that capitalism created for unvirtuous lives. Again, one thing that's fascinating about Marx is that when his ideas are being put out there, it's actually a bunch of Christians who lob onto this. And he, someone who later says religion is the opium of the masses. He's not a pro-religion guy. He's sort of upset that there are other more famous communists out there who are Christians. He's like, these things don't work well together. So he's essentially saying it teaches us the wrong values, right? It teaches us that a belief that a person who doesn't work is worthless. It's like, listen, we sort of lost this medieval concept of leisure. People shouldn't actually have to work. The beautiful thing about a late capital society in the 1800s is that there's a lot more wealth and there's plenty more food. So not everyone has to work, and people who don't work should not be looked down upon. We should subsidize people's leisure. So people who don't work were sort of stigmatized, and he rejected this. Right? He thought it was ludicrous that like the standard 2 weeks vacation, anything beyond that is sinful. So like this, he kind of hits at the Protestant work hard ethic. Like Ruskin, he's saying we should look at the finer things in life. We shouldn't buy more things. That's not going to make us happier, right? He talked about the ability that we shouldn't have our lives exclusively devoted around the work we do. We should go hunting and fishing in the morning and work in the afternoon if we want to. He critiqued this notion that worthwhile people are the only ones who make money. A lot of these ideas get a greater voice because the 1850s he teams up with Friedrich Engels. Engels is the son of an industrialist from Hamburg, Germany. His father owns a number of factories. And eventually he runs a factory, I think it's in Manchester. And he's actually a really good manager, right? Production goes up, but he's also sort of sad at what he's doing. He's sort of the guilty, the rich person with a conscience. So he meets Marx, they talk for 10 days straight, and he starts funding Marx's sort of life to write. In 1845, he writes The Condition of the Working Class, which is their lives are really terrible and short. He doesn't do much about it in his factory necessarily, but he sort of announces the reality for many workers. A few years later, in 1848, there are pro-democracy revolutions all across Europe. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, there had been a sort of conservative resurgence where the revolutionists were put down, some ideas adopted, but governments were essentially monarchies. And all across Europe, there's these revolutions to end that. They didn't end well for those who are pro-democratic, right? Their sort of revolutions would have to wait a few generations. But in the midst of this excitement, Engels and Marx put forward the Communist Manifesto, right, which is your source document for this week, or a section of it, which begins with that evocative phrase, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism," right? And by 1883, the year Karl Marx dies, a lot of these ideas are really sort of fleshed out in a book called Capital. right? Some of the key ideas from this text: society depends on how it apportions its resources, the material basis of all life. This is a very economically driven framework. They argue all human history is a story of people's struggle for material resources. So you have these different classes, right? Class struggle. You have the proletariat, the working class, who are struggling against the bourgeoisie, or we now might call this bougie individuals. And there's a finite amount of money, material, probably wrong about this, in the world, so there's this class struggle. And from his Hegelian perspective, industrialization is only the latest of such struggles, one that factory owners have won. The solution, which they sort of don't fully flesh out, is that the workers of the world should unite and overthrow the masters in class war. So, at the end of the manifesto, he calls for revolution. He calls for violence. Now, at the end of his life, he eases up a bit on this. He actually suggests that maybe we should form political parties and win elections and then do things like this. So he kind of waffles in between how intense the violence should be. Of course, in 1917, it's the violence that wins out. But for him, there's going to be this workers' paradise where everyone works according to his own abilities. We've reached a sort of nirvana after the revolution. Okay. Now, there's of course critiques of Marx's world, right? He defines happiness incredibly narrowly, right? There's more to happiness than economic prosperity, like spirituality, religion, other things. Of course, he disregards human nature, right? Many of the workers want to be the factory managers. They're striving for sort of increasing their lot in this world, for working hard. And in 1945, sort of a democratic socialist, someone politically to the left of someone like Bernie Sanders, named George Orwell, an iconic mid-century writer, wrote a book called Animal Farm, which critiqued what happens after the revolution. Right here, he wrote this book, which some of you may have read in 8th, 9th, 10th grade, where you have these animals led by a pig named Napoleon, who overthrows the human farmers, right? And they create this perfect communist society, but somebody has to run that society, this communist collective, right? And they make phrases like all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. So he critiques this notion: what happens after the revolution? How do you sort of run a society from the top down? There'll still be people who are hooked up and those who are not. Now, what's interesting about Marx, and listen, I'm looking forward to your conversations about capitalism, communism, and sort of the flaws in each of these systems, perhaps. But in Marx's time, revolutions fail. Monarchies take over. There's a picture of Napoleon III. Germany does not yet become modern Germany, even though, as you look at this map, there's worker and pro-democratic revolutions all across Europe. And it's worth pointing out why this failure. Why is there no communist revolution in the 1900s? Well, for starters, there's a lot of jobs. There's near full employment in the economies of Europe and America at this time. And workers are teaming up. They're forming unions to gain hard-won rights, like shorter work days, better pay. If you're injured, there's money for you, things like this. And there's all sorts of humanitarian organizations that emerge, like the Salvation Army, that look after the spiritual lives and the material lives of the workers. Churches form something called the social gospel, that sort of looking at the plight of the worker in the big city. Meanwhile, many of these workers form political parties called socialist democratic parties, which achieve some sense of legitimacy and success. Right? Für eine Zukunft ohne Angst, says the SPD in Germany, for a future without fear. And some of this you see in policies emerging in America, like FDR's New Deal in the 1930s. Workers also receive the franchise. More and more workers get to vote, so they feel like they have agency in their lives. And more, slowly but surely, working conditions begin to improve. But as we all know, Marxism would ironically catch fire in the early 20th century in places that Marx did not expect them to catch fire. Marx thought that there'd be working class revolutions in sort of really mature economic societies. He thought it would happen in America and in England. So when it first occurred in Russia in 1917, a society that was not very advanced in a capitalistic stage, very sort of feudal in some ways, proved to be really ironic. And as this revolution spread from Russia to China to several third world countries, including Cuba and our hemisphere, it sort of caused us to re-examine the past in new ways. All right, that's it for today's lecture. Next week, there are quizzes coming up that'll probably feature this in last week's discussion as well as the readings. Take care, folks. Have a good week. See you on the discussion.